Good morning. Give everybody another minute to join us. Okay, well, I would like to say hello and thank you all for joining us today for Coffee with the Criminalist. I'd like to reintroduce our DNA expert, Nancy Dinh, who will be discussing the challenges and some lessons learned from examining old and degraded physical evidence as it relates to DNA testing and or retesting in cold cases and post-conviction casework. There will be a 5 to 10 minute availability at the end of the webinar for Q&A. If you have any questions along the way, as I mentioned, please feel free to submit them in the chat box, or you can ask Nancy directly at the end of the session and we'll address them as best as possible. We'll also be posting this recording to our website soon after, so you can revisit or share this webinar and previous webinars with your team or any other interested colleagues. So take it away, Nancy.
Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you so much, Cindy, for the introduction. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. This is the second chapter of the Forensic Analytical Crime Lab DNA Cold Case series. In this installment, I'll be highlighting a few cases and ways in which my experiences working on older, more complex cases have helped me come up with strategies for how to approach challenging evidence as I continue to work on these types of cases. So just as a quick recap of chapter 1, I essentially gave a very general overview as to the various things to think about prior to tackling the evidence itself. So I essentially walked through each step of the case intake process, and I gave some insight into how I design my sort of roadmap for tackling old evidence, especially evidence that had been previously tested multiple times in the distant and not so distant past. So that roadmap consisted of knowing the story behind the evidence, where it came from, who handled it, all reports associated with it, basically accumulating all the information you can get about that evidence to help you decide if you should even consider testing or retesting it. So sometimes testing or retesting isn't absolutely necessary. Having a DNA expert break down what previous results mean in a more meaningful, digestible way can actually prompt you to think about whether or not DNA is really the avenue you want to go down. So old evidence is old evidence, no matter the status of the case. So why I say that is because in the previous chapter, I went over the fact that from an evidence standpoint, cold cases and post-conviction cases are generally the same. So even though a lot of the cases I'll be covering today are more post-conviction cases, the strategies when it comes to approaching these types of evidence it's essentially the same because the evidence is just as old or just as poorly preserved, et cetera, et cetera. You approach both types as if you're trying to solve the case from scratch. And, as I just mentioned, you're often working with old, maybe the potentially crummy evidence, lots of evidence that's been sampled before, poorly stored evidence, evidence that's been stored in a shack in Hawaii or Florida, humidity. It's generally not pretty and oftentimes not easy to sort through. Another point to mention is that contamination concerns weren't as prevalent back then as they are now, with the more sensitive technology that we have. So that's why we also have to consider collecting things like elimination samples from law enforcement or lab personnel, just to make sure that they're not in it. So just as a really brief example, I worked on this 1995 home invasion robbery. It's a post-conviction case. And in this case, I received a handgun. And mind you, DNA testing had never been performed in this case. I believe it was eyewitness testimony that ended up with helping the conviction of this person. And so the gun was collected. My lab received the gun, and basically the client just wanted to know, is there a way that the convicted defendant was wrongfully convicted, right? He's actually innocent of the crime, that the true perpetrator of this robbery is their DNA is on this gun. And so I test the gun. Um, because I'm looking at this gun from like a use standpoint, I'm sampling individual areas of the gun, and this is just a sort of tip when it comes to requesting DNA testing of things like firearms. But if you're looking at a weapons possession case, you can a general or global swab of a gun is perfectly fine because the person's DNA just shouldn't be on it in general. But if you're looking at a case where you may be considering potential use of a firearm, then you may want to separate the different sections of the gun and sample them separately. So in this case, that's what I did, sampled it, and from the trigger and the grip, I get this really nice profile that actually the convicted defendants eliminated from. And so, the next logical step is to submit the sample to CODIS. However, I forget that CODIS also will ask you, essentially, are there any elimination samples to consider? Is there an owner of the gun? Is there someone who handled the gun? Just because when you get a nice profile from a gun, it is a bit unusual. Typically, it's these very complex mixtures. And so I talked to the client, and it just so happened that the investigator or the detective who was working on the case, he was about to retire and was more than willing to give over a DNA sample. And I mean, I'm telling you the story because I think you know where it's going. But the DNA that was on the trigger and on the grip actually came from the detective. And so, really, this evidence wasn't very helpful at all for anybody in the end because of this contamination incident. Anyway, um, so just really quickly on post-conviction cases. Um, like I mentioned before, the strategies are the same when it comes to evidence in both types of cases, cold cases and post-conviction cases. While the condition of the evidence may be the same in both types of cases, post-conviction work differs, obviously, because someone has been convicted of the crime, right? So typically we get these types of cases because the convicted defendant has successfully appealed their conviction, and now they're seeking DNA testing to help prove their innocence. And maybe along the way, someone else's guilt. Um, a lot of the defendants believe they were convicted on the basis of faulty or questionable evidence, such as coerced confessions, eyewitness accounts, and junk science, such as bite mark analysis. So, with the rising number of wrongful conviction appeals, we also see growing efforts to investigate these cases by the defense, the district attorney, or sometimes both offices jointly. So the next two cases, or the first two cases I'll be discussing, are examples of cases where in gathering DNA reports, we find that the results seem a little bit confusing, or perhaps two independent rounds of testing of the same exact evidence send you mixed messages or produce conflicting results. So in this first case, this is a 1987 sexual assault of a woman in Philadelphia. Late one evening, the victim was leaving a grocery store when she ran into a man asking her for a ride to a mobile station because his car wouldn't start. The victim agreed to give him a ride. During the ride, the man asked the victim to pull over to the side of the road, at which time he attacked her and took control of the vehicle. He drove for about 5 to 10 minutes, stopped the car, and then he removed the victim's clothing and raped her. He allowed her to put her clothes back on, including her underwear, after the assault. Through an eyewitness account, the victim identified the convicted defendant as her assailant. The victim indicated that she was not sexually active, so there should be no other male on any intimate samples collected from her. So the initial testing in this case was done in 1987 by the state's lab, and they reported finding sperm on the victim's underwear. So here's the upper portion of the underwear. It's the upper back outer portion of the underwear. So you can see right here where I circled is a sample that they took. You can see the little void there. Um, so semen was detected in this sample. However, there was no further testing of this, which is not totally unusual for that decade, right? As more modern day DNA testing didn't really become a thing until the 90s. So then in a later report issued by an independent private lab in 2002, they reported that semen was not detected on the underwear at all. I don't know what their access was to the 1987 report or to any of the bench notes to see this finding, but this is a little bit confusing, right, to get two reports that say completely opposite things. So although the latter results from that independent lab seem more helpful for the defense attorney, right? There's no semen on there, so maybe no rape happened. What would be even more helpful is if the conflicting results could be cleared up and if semen actually was present, if the convicted defendant or their client can be exonerated through an elimination. So in 2016, the evidence came to FACL. We re-examined the underwear and detected possible seminal fluid in the very stain that previously tested positive in 1987. So we took a sample of that stain and we performed DNA testing. And the results, the decision was confirmed, and the convicted defendant's semen was found on the victim's underwear. So had this been a cold case and not a post-conviction case, one may see the 2002 results and be like, oh, shucks, guess that evidence is no good. We at FACL always say, don't shut that door just yet till you've had another expert look at it. And I stress this in the last presentation as well, that when it comes to these challenging and complex cases, it's okay to have trust issues. So before I jump into this next case, I want to talk a little bit about YSTR testing. So YSTR testing, or Y chromosomal STR DNA testing, it's specific to sex chromosome. The DNA is specific to a sex chromosome found in biological males, which is the Y gene. It's useful in paternity investigations and missing persons cases as well. And all males within the same paternal line have the same Y STR profile. So sometimes it's helpful when you try to establish paternity of two males, but it's not helpful if you're trying to figure out if dad committed the crime or if son committed the crime, right? Because they have the same exact profile. As an aside, traditional STR testing, which is what you're all likely very familiar with, is called autosomal STR testing. So autosomal STR testing targets DNA that's inherited from both mom and dad, that ends up creating this unique combination of DNA that is rarer than rare. So when you see those stats that are 1 in nonillion or 12 in sextillion, or sorry, 1 in 100 sextillion, something like that, those are all autosomal statistics. YSTR testing is especially useful in resolving mixed DNA samples, wherein there's a small amount of male DNA in the presence of an abundance of female DNA. So if you have a sample with a lot of female and only a minute amount of male DNA, using autosomal STR analysis will likely just give you the female's profile. And that's just because there's just so much of the female's DNA that it ends up masking any DNA other than hers. So like a vaginal sample, for example, you'd fully expect that there's a ton of the female's DNA. In those circumstances, YSTR testing is the way to go. So there are some limitations, unfortunately. The statistical rarity is low because of the way it's inherited. It's usually in the thousands, maybe, tens of thousands if you're very lucky and you have something rare, like a rare gene in there. But otherwise, it's pretty low just because of all the sharing. And If there's too much female DNA, that can cause technical issues and make it difficult to actually read your results. And then, of course, it's not CODIS eligible, so that's a big thing as well. So you have to really rely on having some known samples yourself. So this next case is an example of where YSTR testing was used. So this is a 1999 sexual assault case. It's post-conviction as well. Um, while walking home from a convenience store, a woman noticed a man holding a shovel, apparently following her. The woman quickened her pace, but the man caught up to her and attacked her with the shovel. The man dragged the victim into a pickup truck and continued the assault. Eventually, the victim was able to escape and ran home, where she and her husband called the police to report the incident. She was taken to the hospital and treated for injuries to her face, including her injuries included broken and missing teeth. And she also had injuries to her groin and genital regions. The sexual assault kit and the clothing the victim wore at the time of the assault, including her jeans, were collected as evidence. So the victim's description of her assailant caused police to focus on a man who had been seen at another store nearby as police officers were patrolling that area around the time of the attack. The victim identified the convicted defendant as her assailant from the second store's video security tape and from a police photo lineup. And given those two things, he was arrested. The victim told police that she and her husband last had consensual sex a few days prior, and she also admitted to having an affair with the person who we will call the other man. So in sexual assault cases, it's important to know these consensual sex partners because you want to get as many elimination samples as possible to make sure that your DNA results are probative. So in 1999, the state lab, they received the sexual assault kit and the victim's genes. So these are the genes. These are the genes. Um, so they only examined the genes. So DNA testing at the time of a stain that was found on the inside crotch of the jeans revealed two male profiles, the victim's husband and an unknown male. So the defendant was eliminated as this unknown male. At the time of the testing of this 1999 testing, the police did not obtain a DNA sample from the other man. So they couldn't compare him to this. Because the absence of evidence does not necessarily mean the absence of a crime, the defendant was convicted despite the DNA evidence not really being informative. So in 2016, FACL received the evidence. At this time, the victim's sexual assault kit could not be located by law enforcement, so we tested the genes as well. The DNA testing was done that was done in 1999 produced DNA profiles that were not eligible for CODIS because CODIS had specific rules for what is eligible, and that profile at the time was not. So at this point, our objective was really just to simply develop a profile for the unknown male so we can submit that profile to CODIS. So here's a close-up of the inside crotch. You can see where it was previously sampled. There's a giant void there. This is what it looks like under an alternate light source, which is essentially a black light. Biological fluids tend to glow or fluoresce, so it's a nice screening tool that can help guide your sampling. So I took these two samples sort of adjacent to the previous sample. And I got the same results as the first lab. Victim's husband, unknown male. We submitted these results to CODIS and no hit. So the convicted defendant was yet again eliminated. Interestingly enough, we compared the other man's DNA profile and he was also eliminated. So this was starting to feel like the real deal. In 2018, after much persistence on the part of the attorneys, the sexual assault kit was located. Here's the kit. So sexual assault kits in general can be stored at the lab, at the police department, or at the courthouse. Tracking the movement of your evidence through police reports and disposition statements and lab reports, et cetera, could provide some clues as to where the evidence might be. So we tested the vaginal swabs, and unfortunately, that was a bust. Any male DNA or semen that was detected on there came back to the husband. The only other semi-intimate sample in the kit was a toilet tissue from the victim's first urine void. For a sample like this, some possible sources of DNA include assailant DNA, sorry, include semen, saliva, sweat, anything could have been left behind sort of on the surface of her vagina. So here are the two tissues. I uncrumpled one of them a bit to get a better picture of the staining. And here are the tissues after sampling. So the red boxes are where I sampled. I detected a small amount of male DNA in a sea of female DNA, so I had no choice but to do YSTR testing if I wanted any kind of informative results. So with YSTR testing, the female victim's DNA will not be detected. So that's what I did. The YSTR profile matched that of the convicted defendants. Crazy. So we suspect that that unknown male that we've been searching for so many years on the inside of her jeans might have just been another side piece that she didn't tell police about. So in this case, we learned that thinking outside the box a little bit instead of always falling back on routine evidence specimens can sometimes be more informative than we think. Now, I have a couple more cases. I'll try to quickly get through these where evidence was believed to be consumed, but the cases really just needed a second look. So this is an actual cold case. This is a 1986 sexual assault murder, which occurred where the victim was found deceased along the highway. So little was known about her. A sexual assault kit was collected from the victim. And the first known round of DNA testing was done in 2003. Semen was detected on the victim's vaginal swab, but the DNA result was determined to be ineligible for CODIS. Semen was not detected on the anal swab during this round of testing, and subsequent revisits by other labs to this evidence did not include the anal swab, likely because of this finding, right? This initial finding that there was no semen on it. So in 2020, I received the victim sexual assault kit. I opened it up, and all that remained was a nose swab, which is a weird one, and some empty vials. So one of which was labeled anal swab, this one. I noticed there was residue on the inside of the anal swab tube, so I decided to give it a shot and sample it, even though the previous lab said there was no semen on the anal swab itself. Like I said, trust issues. If there's anything I learned from my years of retesting items, it's that it doesn't hurt to double check a result. So from that sample, I discovered sperm among the cell debris. So in fact, there was semen on the anal specimen. I took my sample through DNA testing and got a result that was a mixture of at least two males and a major male and at least one minor, and submitted this result to CODIS for search. The outcomes of that search are still pending. So from this case, we can see that again, the true results were not uncovered during the first round of testing. And just because the parent specimen or substrate isn't there, like the swab wasn't there, or the item is identified as quote unquote consumed, all hope isn't necessarily lost. Some of the biology from the substrate or the swab could have transferred onto the packaging, and so long as the interior of the packaging was protected from the elements or potential contamination, the contents could still be useful. So again, it's useful to think outside the box, or in this case, think inside the box, literally.
Yeah.
Before we jump into this last consumption-related case, I want to quickly discuss microscope slides. So there are two types of slide evidence that you typically encounter in sexual assault investigations. There's smear slides, which are created by the medical examiner. And this is typically during the sexual assault exam, the swab is collected from the victim or the complainant, and then they'll take that fresh swab and then they'll essentially smudge it onto a slide. So that's a smear slide. Then you also have a cell debris slide, which is created by the DNA lab. So we get our swab, we cut the swab, put in a tube, soak it in water, and then take about 5% of that sample and put that on a slide just so we can see what's in this sample. So, there's sort of two goals when it comes to examination or testing of microscope slides. You either look at the smear slides or the cell debris slides simply for information, like, oh, there's sperm cells. Great. Now I know how to pursue the rest of my testing. Or there might be situations where all you have is a slide, so you have to sample it. So this is it's more of a last resort, because if you don't have the swabs or you don't have any other evidence, then typically we'll go to the slides. And that just involves prying the cover slip off, sampling, using your own new swabs and sampling it. And when depending on how the slide was created and how the slide was stored, the cells and the DNA may or may not be usable, but you don't know until you try. So anyway, now that you know a little bit about microscope slides, then you probably want to know. Let's continue with the next case. So this final case that we'll discuss, it's a 1983 sexual assault murder. It's a post-conviction case. This is a case where the sexual assault kit was in fact confirmed to be destroyed. To my understanding, a sexual assault that results in a homicide does not have a statute of limitations, so there might have been some miscommunication that led to this kit being destroyed. On the morning of August 19th, 1983, the body of a 19-year-old female was found behind a dental office in Tampa, Florida. It was determined she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. The Hillsborough County Medical Examiner reported a pattern injury that resembled a bite mark on the victim's face, believed to have been inflicted around the time of her death. Once the injury was confirmed as a bite mark by a forensic odontologist, authorities began collecting bite mark impressions from persons of interest, including the then 18-year-old defendant. The defendant, knowing he had nothing to do with the crime, consented to having his teeth impressions collected. However, the forensic odontologist concluded that his teeth impression matched the bite mark on the victim. This evidence, in conjunction with incriminating testimony provided by a jailhouse informant, led to the arrest and conviction of the defendant. So the victim's sexual assault kit was the only evidence submitted for biological testing in this case. In 1983, the sex assault kit swabs were tested and semen was identified. But the swabs weren't further tested after that. As I mentioned before, it's not unusual in the 80s for there to not be DNA testing. The kit was destroyed in 2000. The convicted defendant maintained his innocence and attempted to appeal his conviction in 2006. However, the court believed that the bulk of the evidence was destroyed, so his request was denied in 2007. And again, through much persistence, the defendant's attorneys were able to successfully appeal his conviction based on the unreliable and scientifically questionable bite mark evidence, and as well as the jailhouse informant testimony. So the attorneys did all the research they could about the evidence, tracking where it's been and where it went, and they found out that the smear slides collected by the medical examiner still existed at the medical examiner's office. So this is truly miraculous, because almost always those smear slides that were created during the sexual assault exam, those slides go into the sex assault kit. So they should have been destroyed in 2000, but for some reason, they were preserved at the medical examiner's office. So in 2020, those slides came to FACL for testing. So here are the smear slides. We have the rectal, vaginal, and oral smear slides. Sometimes they come unstained, like just a completely clear slide, and then I'd have to go and stain them. And then sometimes, like in this case, they come with the staining already on it, so I didn't need to. Staining just helps it make it easier for us to make out cells when we're looking at it under the microscope, so we can look to see if there are sperm cells or whatever other types of cells there could be. So a peek of the rectal slide under the microscope, and you see in this frame a single sperm. So that's what a sperm cell looks like, for those of you who don't know. For the vaginal, we see 2 sperm. So we can confirm from both of these samples that there is semen. So just as a quick aside, normally when a DNA analyst makes a slide, the cell debris slide, they use maybe 5% or less of the total amount of cells in a sample to make the slide. Because I told you they put the swab in the tube, and then they take about 5% of the liquid that they soak their swab in to create their slide. So they still have plenty of sample left, even after making their slide. In this case, what we had were just these slides, and they're smear slides. So what we see on the slide isn't 5% of what we have, it's 100% of the evidence that we have. So that makes sampling slides all the more trickier because we already know we don't have much DNA to work with, and we also don't know what condition the DNA is in. So I swabbed all 3 slides separately, and I processed those swabs for DNA. In the end, the most usable result I got was from the vaginal slide. In the sperm fraction, there was a mixture of at least 3 contributors, including at least 2 males. One male can account for about 76% of the DNA, while the other male accounted for about 5% of the total DNA. The remaining DNA comes from the victim. So I processed the defendant's DNA, and he was eliminated. I didn't want to jump to any conclusions just yet because, as we know from the previous case with the genes, that this might not really mean much. We don't know the victim's history. She's deceased, and she can't tell us. So, if she had any sexual partners or anything like that, we don't know. So, because we can't get elimination samples, this profile was submitted to CODIS for search. It ends up hitting to 2 people, 2 convicted offenders actually, who were currently serving life prison sentences for other crimes. They were known to be co-conspirators. We later get reference samples from these 2 individuals, and they were confirmed to be the contributors to her vaginal sample. So just in my own sort of research about these people, I learned that these 2 suspects, they went on a killing spree back in 1983. 1 month before this victim's murder, both suspects raped and murdered another woman from the same area. And that case was actually recently solved with DNA. And then 2 months after our victim's murder, the same pair of dudes accosted a man in a parking lot. And then they drove him to an isolated area, beat him up, and then ran over him with their car, killing him. One of the suspects pled guilty to the sexual assault and murder of both women in 1983, adding 2 more consecutive life sentences on top of his current life sentence for a different murder. And there isn't any information about the status of the other suspect's case, but he may possibly get the death penalty because he also killed 2 inmates in prison and because it's Florida. So in 2020, 13 years after being told there was no evidence to test, and 37 years since he was in prison for this crime, the convicted defendant in this case was released and formally exonerated in 2023. So key takeaways, these are questions that you should ask yourself as you are evaluating the DNA evidence in your case. And again, even though most of what I talked about in this presentation were post-conviction cases, the same rules and the same tips and tricks apply to cold cases because the evidence is essentially the same. So you want to ask yourself, has DNA testing ever been done in this case? If not, why not? Would it be useful now? Have an expert look at what testing's already been done, and are the results conflicting and or confusing? Is it important to resolve this confusion? Should we retest it? Should we consider YSTR testing if autosomal STR testing was unsuccessful in developing a male profile from trace amounts of male DNA? Are there any items that have not been sampled, and do we know why? Would it be useful now? When a lab says an evidence item is consumed, is it really consumed? Does the consumed evidence, such as a vaginal swab, come in a different form, like the vaginal slide, right? So really do keep these things in mind when you are approaching the evidence in this case in deciding whether or not you want to test, retest, or have another person take a look at it and help sort of clarify those things for you. So remember to make every effort to know your evidence. And when it comes to DNA results, fact check them, double check them, and question everything. And the goal in any investigation is to uncover the real story about the evidence. And if you're not careful about your evidence, you can sometimes miss some crucial things and ultimately deliver an incomplete and maybe even false narrative behind the evidence. So thank you, everybody, for listening to this presentation. Thank you, Cindy, for putting this together and hosting. Sorry, I went a little bit over time. Here's my contact info on the screen on the left, as well as the number for the general line just below my information. This is a picture of me and my floof. She's actually an expert in training. She just can't quite fit her paws around a pipette yet, so she's got a ways to go. But other than DNA, we also offer services in firearms, crime scene reconstruction, blood scene pattern analysis, serial number restoration, things like that. So please feel free to contact us with questions about anything forensics. Yeah, that's it.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. Great job. There was one question that was submitted,
Oh.
and that question is, what's the current industry practice regarding mixtures? How many is too many?
So with regard to mixtures, it depends on the individual labs protocols. So various labs will be more conservative in their interpretation, some will be less. So, and also depends on the quality of the profile. So sometimes you'll see that even a mixture of three, which doesn't sound too crazy high, if it's very little DNA, if it's degraded and it's a mixture of three, it still may not be interpretable as a result, right? Because it's just too complicated. Um, but if it's like a pristine mixture of three, that's easy. Um, some labs will also interpret mixtures up to five people. It kind of, again, depends on the quality and the quantity of DNA. And then one major difference for some labs is the technology they have on hand. So while we can all do autosomal STR testing and produce these mixture profiles, well, do we have a means of sort of um, sorting out these mixtures, right? Is it the human or do we have a computer source? And so for a lot of labs that use what's called probabilistic genotyping, that makes it significantly easier to interpret complex mixtures of, three, four, five people. And so it really depends on what type of resources each individual lab has to tackle complex mixtures.
Great. Thank you for your question, Christian. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and give it a shout. I guess that's a no. I had a question actually, Nancy. When you were mentioning about the eligibility for CODIS, have those eligibility requirements changed over time?
They had changed over time. So initially, there are several sort of criteria for what makes a profile eligible. Firstly, it has to have some level of probativeness, the evidence itself. And then also there needs to be some level of rarity to the actual profile. So that probativeness aspect of it, I think back in the day it was a little more lax. Anybody submitting a profile didn't really need to explain like, oh, this item is probative because. But I think there was perhaps a little bit of an abuse of this system, such that now CODIS has to sort of screen samples such that they do have to be probative. So you have to explain, where does this evidence come from? How does it relate to the crime? Um, and then the other aspect, the technical aspect of it, is the rarity of the profile. So the rarity of the profile sort of goes hand in hand with what they call the CODIS core loci. And so there are a certain minimum number of genes that you need information from in order for it to be eligible for CODIS. And then not only do you need that minimum amount of information or minimum number of genes, you also need it to be rare enough. So it used to be 1 in 10 million. I'm not 100% sure what the current rarity statistic is. So back then, there used to be 13 CODIS core loci, and then as of 2020, they increased it to 20 core loci. Actually, might have been sooner than that, maybe 2018, to 20 core CODIS loci. So it has increased, and that increase is not necessarily just for stringency purposes, right? To make sure that we're not just putting these profiles that will hit to everybody in the database, but it's because the kits themselves, the actual genotyping kits that create these profiles, they've also expanded. So there's a lot more genes that are being typed. So that's why it increased to 20. So just to sort of summarize, that they have changed over time. And now it's really just meeting the two criteria of, is your evidence probative and can you prove that? And then Is it rare enough so that it doesn't hit to everybody in the database?
Got it. Thank you so much. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, then we will have this webinar recording available on our website soon. Thank you all for joining us. I appreciate it. Thank you, Nancy. Great job.
Great job.
Thanks.